recent relentless kind of streams of attacks from anti-LGBTQ groups, some would say that the sentiment around brand activity at Pride may appear to be vehemently divided this year. But rather bowing down to these attacks, this is now more than ever the time for brands to show how they support the LGBTQ plus community. In our recent WPP Unite research report, Beyond the Rainbow, we look at effective ways in which brands can support the community during Pride Month and year-round. And that's also our topic for discussion today, is how to be a true ally during Pride and beyond. I'm Shaun Frazao, Global Head of Strategy at Wavemaker. And in the room with me, I'm very excited to have Albert Hogan. He's Senior Director for Brand and Content at Audible UK. And then also online, we have the two authors of the Beyond the Rainbow report. We have Zoe Bowen-Jones. She's our Senior Global Insights Director at Wavemaker, and Devon, Esper, Strategy Manager for my US office in New York. Thank you all for joining us today. Really excited to have you here. Let's jump in. Zoe, I'm going to start with you to give us a bit of insights from the report. And the first question really is around Pride. We know that it's Pride Month now, which means it's the month of rainbow flags, of corporate logos. And in the Beyond research study, we've seen some feedback from the queer community describing this as rainbow washing. I have perhaps myself a bit more of a less nuanced view, or a bit more of a rudimentary view about this, just believing that representation matters, the fact that brands such as Disney or Levi that are entrenched in households across the world will be making us visible as significant. But I also really understand the critique that this could be seen as superficial. How should brands be thinking about supporting the LGBTQ community, not just during Pride, but also beyond?
Yeah, I mean, that speaks right to the title of the research, right? So it's about going beyond the rainbow. But I think your point is a really good one, because so we asked people about, brands or organizations changing their logo to rainbow during Pride Month. And actually, it was quite divisive. So slightly more than half of LGBTQ plus people actually said that they like it. So I think it's important to say, and I agree with your point that, you've got to start somewhere, right? And depending on like where you are in the world, that representation and that visible representation can be a really important starting point. But yeah, like you said, there were lots of kind of accusations of rainbow washing. It felt like some of the comments when we asked around it were quite eye-rolly. It was like, oh, they all do it, blah, blah, blah. And so I think, even from thinking about like whether it's an effective brand strategy to get you noticed, well, when we asked them about it, there was no one brand which stood out. It was just like, oh, everyone does it. That's what happens at Pride. So while I don't think that in itself is necessarily a negative thing, it's not going to make a difference either for your brand perceptions or for the community itself. And so what we found when we asked about what, the types of queer advertising that people would like to see, there were kind of three key categories. The first was raising awareness of issues or legislation facing the LGBTQ plus community. The second was featuring more diverse LGBTQ plus characters. And then the third was raising money or awareness for LGBTQ plus focused charities. Now, I think those are obviously quite broad, and there's lots of different ways lots of different routes that you could go down. But I think when we kind of went back and pulled out some of the best brand examples in this space, what they all had in common was that there was a very clear sort of link to their brand position or their products, their place in the world. And it was an ongoing thing, as opposed to, here's something that we're doing for the month of Pride, and then we're going to step away from it and continue with something completely different.
That's really interesting. And I want to go to Albert about this, because I know Audible does some fantastic work in this space. And Zoe points out some really interesting points about what people in the community tend to expect from brands beyond just Pride. Talk to me a little bit about how Audible has approached this beyond Pride.
Sure. Well, I guess the first thing I would say, and this is borne out in the research, is that we are seeing people who identify as LGBTQI plus as a growing audience with each generation. So for us as a brand, there's a growth audience there, and something that we should be taking more and paying more attention to, and spending time thinking about how we can be authentic and relevant for that audience. With Gen Z, I think almost 1 in 5 are identifying as queer in some form or shape or form. And so we actually think you have to, I absolutely agree, starting somewhere, even if it's a logo change for Pride is a good thing, and the visibility is important. But I think you have to earn that throughout the year. And so we are very focused at Audible on making sure we're thinking about supporting the community throughout the year. And we do that in different ways. So, for instance, in the UK in January, we were a lead sponsor for RuPaul's DragCon in London, which was a fantastic event. And our role there was we basically created an Audible stage and gave a platform to the amazing talent within that franchise to just share their stories. And, we're lucky in a way in that at Audible, our business is storytelling. And so I can imagine, there's people in similar roles to me in sort of more consumer goods industries and the like, where they're kind of struggling with this a bit. I think it all comes down to raising awareness for the stories and giving a voice and platform and being relevant to that audience.
And you make a really interesting point about it being a growth audience, right? That it's people are not just gay or lesbian or trans 1 month of the year. We are shoppers who shop all around the year. And Devon, as the strategist, the person who sits with the plans of clients and have to go to them with strategies of how do we include more activity that reaches this community? How do we do this? What are tactics? What are ways in our plans on an ongoing basis to reach this community?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think some of us have spoken about it earlier in that Pride should be a celebration of what you're doing year round. And of course, it makes sense to show up during Pride because that's a really important beat in consumer activity. Everyone's really excited by it. But the reality is that everyone's advertising. So it's quite hard to stand out from a crowd. Like Zoe said, no one really notices one brand doing one thing over the other. And so by doing this kind of work year round, you can make a bigger impact because less people are doing this kind of work. And so it just positions you as a partner to this community long term. And a lot of media partners and entertainment organizations are producing this content year round. So partnering with them to continue to amplify that work and show up in queer spaces where queer people are consuming queer media, it's a really great way to engage with this community year round versus just this 1 month where everyone likes to get a little bit excited about
it. And I think, as you say, so there are different ways in which we do this. Most people expect brands to do this in Pride Month, and I think as more and more brands are doing it outside of Pride Month, there is unfortunately groups of people who don't agree with this, and we've seen this backlash happening. So let's talk a little bit about how do we sustain the support regardless of this backlash that might happen. And I'm going to go to you with this, Albert. I'm sure we're all familiar with the recent campaign where Bud Light partnered with trans activist, trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney, and we saw the reaction from the far right in the US. We saw Kid Rock and his fragile masculinity shooting up Bud Light cans. And subsequently what happened is AB InBev placed those marketing executives responsible for the campaign on a leave of absence. They cut their ties with Dylan Mulvaney. We saw some similar activity happening with Target, where they got some backlash from Pride articles in their stores, and they also removed some of those items from their stores. Would you say this is not indicative of brands who solely see the LGBTQ plus community as an opportunity to make money? Some would say this is rainbow capitalism. I think this is incredibly short-sighted just to stop their campaigns because of this backlash. But I think perhaps, what advice do you have from the brand point of view for how to remain strong as a brand when you receive this type of backlash?
Well, I think it comes down to what allyship is, and this is, you know, whether you're an individual or you're a brand, I think the same thing applies, is that to be an ally, you need to be willing to take on some of the prejudice or challenges that the person you're being an ally for, or the community you're being an ally for, experience, and, you know, being true to that. So, for instance, at Audible, we're very clear in terms of we believe in supporting queer communities all year round. We have a range of activities, and we pay real special attention to that. So, you know, Devon mentioned about, you know, Pride being a celebration moment, but all brands pile in. And what we've seen is, so we actually track brand sentiment and brand engagement with specific communities year round. And we see that when we do activity outside of Pride Month, we get a much bigger spike in awareness and consideration. And, you know, it doesn't mean we're not doing things for Pride. We absolutely are, but it's that sustained showing up, being there, and being a partner and a support for that community year round.
Yeah, and I like that idea of saying that it almost comes across as, when you get this backlash, the flip side of that is that the ongoing support also gives you the kind of incremental love from those who believe in your cause. Devon, as someone who works on plans in the US, which unfortunately currently is seeing a lot of the polarization when it comes to brands supporting the LGBTQ plus community, how do we give our clients the reassurance that this sometimes, which is seen as a risky thing to do, is still the right thing to do?
Yeah, and a lot of clients are grappling with this, and I think it comes down to consistency in messaging. You know, whether it's a Pride campaign or just a typical brand campaign, we always say that consistency in messaging is really important because it sticks with your audience and people remember it. And so when you see some of these brands start to go back on some of the messaging that they've done in support of the community, it actually does more harm as if they were to stand their ground, because when you try to satisfy everyone, you end up satisfying no one. And just having that consistent support of the community really works for audiences. Albert, you said it, like when you show up for this audience year round, it has a huge impact in sentiment. And I think Nike is a really great example. They stood their ground and they started coming out in support of the partners that they were working with. And they found that they didn't have as much backlash and people were still really supportive of the brand because they stood their ground. And you're seeing a lot of brands kind of be prepared for this backlash, because when it comes down, we always recommend that you should go back to your values as an organization and really use that to decide whether or not, to take an action. And if you aren't unsure of what those values are of an organization and how you support this community, you should really start to organize those before you start doing these campaigns, because you will get backlash and you need something to lean back on.
And that's so true. I think that it really speaks to this idea of kind of rainbow capitalism. If you as a brand have the sole purpose of just utilizing or leveraging the community to make money, people are going to see that as inauthentic, see that as something that doesn't have purpose. And you're not only going to get backlash from community outside who sees this as not you, as not the brand that they think you are, but you're going to get the backlash from the LGBTQ community as well. And Zoe, I want to go to you with that. In the research, we see like the LGBTQ community is a growing community. More and more people have the freedom or feel they have the freedom to come out. We have more and more LGBTQ plus people entering the workforce, which means more buying ability within this community. How should brands really think about weighing up this decision of making this continuous support and try to ignore or not pay too much attention to some of the reaction they're going to get from the fringes?
Yeah, well, I think the point that you made, like it does feel quite short-sighted, because when you look at the audiences and actually look at how the audiences that you're trying to speak to are made up, I think more people identify as LGBTQ plus than kind of will voice their support, will voice opinions against them, or try to attack brands who are voicing own support. So yeah, I think it's just really important, and one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot is Gen Z, and the fact that a fifth of them identify themselves as LGBTQ plus, and opinions and around allyship have over time kind of improved. Like more and more people see themselves and see their role to champion these communities. And so I think it's really dangerous to sort of bow down to a minority of very loud, people with very extreme views who are kind of orchestrating attacks against brands. And I think, you're absolutely right, Shaun, when you say this is what rainbow capitalism is, and it immediately exposes brands who sort of back away as soon as Pride feels less brand safe than maybe it did when it was just like, oh, this is with glitter and rainbows, which is about that, and it's a celebration, and that's really important. But to back down to that, you've lost a sizable portion of your audience. And one of, looking sort of through the queer advertising history books, one of the brands which I think stands out is Absolute Vodka, because they supported the community when it was so far away from being brand safe. So like at the height of the HIV and AIDS crisis, they were placing ads in The Advocate, which is a queer publication in the US. And I think that's what's earned them over time. That's what's earned them a place at Pride. And on the flip side, pulling away from it and pulling away from support as soon as there's a bit of backlash, that's kind of the opposite of allyship. That's opportunistic.
It really is about your right to be able to play within the kind of space of the LGBTQ community. If you are a true ally as a brand and you're really invested in supporting this community, people are significantly more open to accepting you, like they did with Absolute Vodka, than you just showing up inauthentically as an opportunity to almost just make money off of a really nice celebratory occasion. So I want to talk a little bit about representation, because it's one thing for us to say we want to support the LGBTQ community and we want to market to them, but how we represent our community in media is also important. And in the study, we see that less than 40% of LGBTQ individuals are satisfied with how the community is represented in media. And if we look into the history of LGBTQ representation on screen, we do see significant dehumanization, so the mockery of trans individuals or queer characters being killed off. We see stereotypical portrayals, the flamboyant gays, the indecisive bisexuals, or the angry lesbians. For years, we never got to see a kiss between same-sex individuals, and some programs are still hesitant to do that. Or even just see protagonists that are queer get to live happily ever after. But in recent years, we've started to see that narrative shift a little bit, whether or not that's the really beautiful story in Schitt's Creek, the fun kind of fearlessness we get to see in Drag Race, or the realness and the humanization of non-binary individuals in the series Feel Good. Devon, I think I want to go to you with this first. How important is it that representation in media not only exists, but is an accurate portrayal of the lives of queer individuals? And how can brands use their advertising investment and their relationship with media platforms to help drive this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think oftentimes when people start to think about representation, it can be very obvious when it's a bit of an afterthought, when they've kind of made this campaign, they've made this narrative, and they kind of think at the final casting call, or, okay, what if we made them a queer couple? Or what if they were a gay couple? And really the kind of representation is where the strategy of that representation and having that audience is built into the campaign from the ground up. And it's also about having representation of the entire community. I know we've seen in past research how it kind of just favors cisgender or white gay men. And it's like, yeah, sure, that may be what most people might think of or might be most palpable, but there's so many different dimensions to our community, and there's so many different ways to be queer. And it's important that people see themselves, because not only do people want to see themselves reflected on screen, but people want to experience the stories of people who they might not be exposed to. Not everyone has a queer family member. Not everyone knows a trans person. And having these really meaningful and authentic stories is a great way to experience and engage with the community. And we as brands have a really big opportunity to support this. You know, when we're thinking about where to advertise, it's advertising with these queer media owners where they're actively producing this content. It's working with them to help us to produce content. You know, we always say that, like, to have a queer person in the room or have an expert, but you don't always have an expert in the room. And these queer publishers, they've been breathing this year in, year out, and they're experts on making this content. And so it's a really great opportunity to work with them to produce this content that is wholly representative of our community.
I think people underestimate the importance of representation, right? How important it is for that young gay, lesbian, trans person to see someone like them be portrayed out there, to see that you can be happy in a world like that. It's really important and plays a significant role, I think, in someone's coming out story, but also just in how they see themselves going forward. I think, Albert, how's Audible thinking about representation and the kind of you mentioned it's all about storytelling for you. Like, how do you as a brand tell the stories of these individuals in the most sincere, accurate way?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we take our responsibility very seriously around this in terms of representing the full spectrum of stories from all walks of life and all lived experiences. And the joy of working in audio content is you can be a bit more exploratory, a bit more brave in terms of the types of stories you're telling. And I think Devon's point is really important, is that sometimes the queer community is reduced to a single amalgamous group of people, when actually there's such a range of diversity and lived experiences within that. It's important to be able to pull those stories out and those give a platform to all those voices. So, you know, when it comes to us, and again, you know, we're fortunate in that we're working in content itself. We commission, we look for the best stories, and often some of the most powerful stories come from within the queer community. So, for instance, we have had audio projects where you know, the person's sexuality is not central to the story, it just so happens. And so, for instance, we had a brilliant horror that we created called Sour Hall, which was about a lesbian couple who go and decide to take over a farm in rural England. It just so happens that they're a lesbian couple, right? But we also will sometimes focus on the actual experience itself. And again, we've got a brilliant new audiobook coming out next week, in fact, which is a trans love story. And it's beautiful and it's intimate and it's actually universal. Yeah. The same story applies. It's just seeing it through a different lens. And I think, you know, giving people the exposure to those stories and understanding the experience of people who are different to yourself in whatever way is really important. So there's that content side. And then on the kind of brand and advertising side, to Devon's point, it's central from the get-go. It's like, not only do we have to make sure we're creating brilliant stories that represent the community, but we need to connect with the community and do it in a meaningful way. So, for instance, in our media planning, we've made some commitments around ensuring that we're investing in community media to make sure that we're reaching those audiences. And often our investment as brands, it might be a small part of an overall spend, but actually can have a transformative effect for those groups. So again, we try and commit to that. And we've actually got some hard business metrics around this, which we take seriously as a senior leadership team, and make sure that, we are not just focusing on telling the stories, but also supporting the groups that unlock these stories and support the people.
I think that role of representation and of accurately telling these stories is so important in humanizing LGBTQ individuals and their stories and their experiences. When often what we see in kind of the extreme rhetoric in social media is the dehumanization when we represent our community in this kind of human way, I think it's so powerful in letting people realize just another human, another individual.
And we've got a role to show the great experience it can be from being a part of this community, and give people hope as well. So again, we spend a lot of time, thinking about the serious issues that affect the community, but also trying to think about where can we just celebrate and take great stories and great people and personalities out into the world through our work.
It's great because, and as you said, some of those stories it's you just happen to be a queer individual. It's also just not about the sexuality all the time. And I think for queer individuals, I know for myself, that's so important to see that not everything that is about queer people is about sexuality, but I can also just happen to be gay in that moment. Zoe, I want to get to you because I think it's interesting to understand what the research says about this, what the community expects when it comes to representation, and I think very specifically because Albert also mentioned this idea of being able to channel some of your advertising investment into the platforms that do showcase this and represent the community in this real and accurate way.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the first thing, so we talked about the role for the community. I think one of the things which struck me with some of the findings that we had, particularly when we asked about media, was the role that it can play for allyship. So in the comments that we had, there was a lot of comments that were like, you can't be what you can't see. This gives kids hope. But they weren't all from LGBTQ plus people. I think the vast majority of people have a loved one who identifies as queer. And so they want to show allyship and also improve their understanding. Like, again, I think Albert alluded to how powerful queer stories can often be. And I think, you don't, as someone watching a program or listening to an audiobook, you don't want to only hear stories that are about people whose experiences are exactly the same as yours. And that very much came through. So what we found that 6 in 10 non-LGBTQ plus people actively seek out queer media. And, in thinking about some of like the Oscars this year, Everything Everywhere All at Once had a queer woman at the heart of it. The Last of Us had quite a lot of queer representation, particularly was at episode 4 that everyone lost their minds over. Euphoria, there's loads of massive hits where queer characters are absolutely central to the stories. And in the question, Shaun, you said we really have come a long way, and that's also really resonating with audiences. People want to see this. I'm sorry, actually, the other thing I was going to say is I think you alluded to it. You both alluded to it. Is representation isn't just about the person that you see at the kind of consumer facing end of the content. So it's also about what type of media you invest in. So given that people actively seek out queer content, that feels like the basis of an argument to invest with publications like Diva magazine or Gay Times or The Advocate and others. And then the other thing is the people behind the lens. Like, these stories aren't going to be made, or they're not going to be made well, unless the people making them have lived experience or are able to tap into lived experience in some way.
Agreed. But put your money where your mouth is, is what I can ask brands to do. And I think you touch on something that's so relevant for the next question, Zoe. It's about also the people who have to tell these stories, or the people who develop these stories need to also have that understanding, that lived experiences. And I think it speaks to the idea of how the LGBTQ community experiences the work environment and the kind of opportunities they have in their careers. And we see in the study that less than half of queer individuals are completely out at work. As a gay man myself, I have been quite lucky to work in the really open-minded and accepting industry that is advertising, and I've done it in fairly liberal countries such as South Africa and the UK. But despite that, I know that I still have had moments where I felt less than in the work environment because of my sexuality, and whether or not it is just something as not seeing other people like me in positions of power, or whether or not it's just feeling undermined. But I think how LGBTQ people experience the work environment is so important. And I want to go to you on this first, and we're going to get a little bit personal if you don't mind. Albert, how have you experienced this in your work environment, and what can companies do to drive better inclusion? And I don't think this is just about being queer. I think this is for any minority group that can often feel unwelcome or out of place in the work environment.
Yeah, as a gay man, similarly to you, I've always worked in entertainment, which has been a fairly welcoming environment, and I've always tried to be my authentic self because that's important to me. I'm very aware, though, of my privilege as a cis white gay man. And, one thing I think that the research brings out quite clearly is the sort of cumulative effect of intersectionality and how, everyone's experience, depending on their mix of characteristics, can be very, very different. So I take my responsibility in a leadership position in a business really seriously in terms of being my authentic self and, talking in a way that hopefully makes others feel like that. And we're very fortunate at Audible that we have really strong network groups that talk to all aspects of, shared experience. So whether that's working parents or women in the workplace or, Black communities or queer communities. And something that's central to what we do in Audible is allyship. And so we try to think about what are the commonalities that, even though we are a diverse group of people, there are certain things that unite us and certain challenges that we all face, and how can we be allies for each other? And I think a lot of that comes out from just really open and honest conversations. And for us as allies and leaders to, call things out in the moment if we feel something isn't being handled well, trying to create like a sense of psychological safety so people can feel like they can be themselves. And, I think the one thing the study showed for me is that we have a long way to go. And while, our experience has been, we've been fortunate, there's a lot more to be done there.
Yeah. And I know I personally feel like I also have an obligation as someone senior in work and also someone gay in work to kind of support those coming into the industry as part of the community, to give them the support that I wish sometimes I had, and the support that I got from many other queer individuals in senior positions as well. Devon, I want to go to you with this question. Talk about your experience in the work environment and how you think companies can also drive inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, we're in similar industries, so I have felt very safe and very welcome from day one. Growing up in Canada, it's been a very safe environment. And I think when we think about marketing organizations and kind of how we leverage our talent, something we've said before is just because you're a queer person doesn't make you an expert in queer marketing. And I think it's really important to understand that it's important to have people who have lived experiences to help produce some of the content and campaigns. But it's also important that they understand how to reach these audiences and they actually want to share those experiences. Oftentimes, when we talk about representation, how it's just like a final casting call, that can also happen internally too, where a brand or an agency has a brief where they have to reach a minority audience and they don't actually really think about how they do that. And they just find the closest person who identifies with that minority and says, hey, come join this call, come join this brief because you're gay or you're Black or you have a disability. So you obviously know how to talk to this audience, right? And so it's really important that it isn't just up to queer people or someone in a minority to communicate to their own community. It's important that leadership across the organization and talent across the organization has this kind of understanding of these communities, because then it just makes you feel that much more supported. And I think when leadership takes these positions around inclusivity and is very vocal about the support they give, especially for people coming into the organization, they can then feel safe because they already know the position that leadership in their organization has, so that if and when they do feel that they want to come out, they can feel safe because they already know the position that the organization has. And I think that's critically important to making sure that we have diverse teams, but that those diverse teams feel safe to bring their most authentic selves into work every day.
Yeah, so true. Leadership, educate thyself. Zoe, I want to ask your opinion on this, not just on what the research says people's experiences are, or the community's experiences are at work, but also as our fearless leader of WPP Unite, our LGBTQ kind of community within WPP. What are some of those experiences that are often shared there, and some of the advice that you can also give companies to make this to make everyone in the community's experience within work better?
Yeah, and I think one of the sort of founding principles sounds a bit grand, but one of the founding principles of WPP Unite was like the L supporting the B, supporting the G, supporting the T. I'm getting myself mixed up, but I think that sort of thinking applies more broadly to other diversity groups, or to everyone across the organization. So I guess in my sort of personal experience, like I'm bisexual, but have been in I'm in a long-term relationship with a man, and therefore I'm very aware of my privilege in kind of not experiencing some of the challenges that lots of queer people do face. But I think, you know, it's just important to sort of understand what other people might be going through, and what you know, I guess think about the way that you, I guess everyone needs to sort of think about the way that they approach other people, and the way that, you know, if for like something really simple like do you have a boyfriend, to a woman, just do you have a partner instead? So something like that. But yeah, I guess from a WPP Unite point of view, obviously, as it's kind of a community which has grown really quickly right across WPP, and it's now going global. So it's in the parts of Europe, Australia, APAC, and North America. And I think one of the reasons is because it's united lots of people who are really passionate about this, who understand this and have lived experience of it. But I think one of the key reasons that it's worked so well is because it's had the support of senior leadership, and it's brought in very senior people who have skills, like are excellent communicators and have those skills, and so are able to bring those skills, and have been supported by their agencies in giving that the time to producing that. And so I think it's worked really well, and it's about both the workplace and our work, because those two things come hand in hand. Like, we're not going to make more inclusive work unless we have more inclusive workplaces. So I think that those are the two things. I think that having senior support and looking at it right across everything that we do.
I mean, that's the thing about unconscious bias, right? Is you have to actually put in the work to see it. So it is, to your point, Zoe, just starting to think about how we ask someone a question about their relationships, talking about that idea of a partner. I once introduced my partner to someone I know, and their immediate reaction was, "Oh, do you work together?" Like, no, not that kind of partner. Right. I think we're running out of time, so I want to wrap up with the last question. And to those on streaming us today, thank you. Firstly, the report that we've been referencing, I'm sure will be available on a link somewhere within this post. So please go have a look at it. It's really informative and so important for brands to consider when they're planning their next campaigns. And it's great that we have this data and this research to help guide us when it comes to how do we speak to the LGBTQ plus community. But quantitative data works best when we can kind of contextualize it with some qualitative understanding to just bring back some humanity to those numbers. So I want to ask each of our panelists, and Albert, I'll start with you, is can you give us kind of one piece of advice that you can give brands, not based on the data, but just one human truth that they need to remember when it comes to LGBTQ plus individuals?
I think I'd reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that there is rich diversity within the LGBTQ plus community, and to not diminish it to a single data point or a single tactic, and to embrace that diversity and educate yourself on that diversity, and realize that there is fantastic stories to be told, there is fantastic customers to be had in there, and that, you know, ultimately it's an audience that is in growth and something that we as brands should be taking very seriously. So yeah, I think that would be mine.
Fantastic. Zoe, I'm gonna hand over to you.
I think it sounds maybe a bit basic, but I think to truly understand the importance of pride and of, I guess, queer spaces in general, because yeah, you're right, through data, I think you're never going to be able to understand the nuances of a community and the experiences that they face, and often the kind of internalized shame that this community ends up with. And so I think and I think it's been demonstrated by sort of some of the brands pulling activity around Pride this year. It's just like, oh, we don't want to touch that anymore. But it's like, if everyone in the organization truly understands how joyful Pride can be, because for lots of queer people, going to queer spaces for the first time or going to Pride is just absolute pure joy. And so I think if everyone across an organization starts with understanding that, and that can be in a really celebratory way, then I think we'll all start to make better work.
Thanks, Zoe. Devon, you have the last word.
No pressure. I think what I would say is just to remember that we're all just human, and I think everyone wants to be loved. And not that I'm going to equate a brand with the love of a parent, but you think of kids growing up and you've seen those viral videos of a kid at their music recital or a soccer game, and they're scanning the crowd and they look quite sad until they see their parents, and, you know, their face lights up because someone has like showed up for them, the person that they love. And so we as queer people, we want to be loved, and we want people to show up for us, and we want to see ourselves. And I think we can all share this experience of growing up and not seeing ourselves on screen and not seeing ourselves in ads and being well supported. And I think when brands show up for our community and they show up in a really meaningful way, sure, there's business impact, but it just means so much to us to see ourselves reflected back. And everyone wants that experience, and everyone wants people to show up for them. And so just remember that people just want to see themselves and they want to feel loved, and brands have an opportunity to help us feel that love, especially during Pride, especially throughout the year, in any kind of media and campaigns that they do.
Thanks, Devon. So true. There's a person behind the data point. There's a story behind the data point. Remember that. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Devon. Thank you, Zoe, for coming here, for having this discussion, for opening yourselves up, sharing some of your own personal stories. I think it means a lot to everyone that's streamed. Thank you very much. And to everyone in the LGBTQ community, happy Pride. Thank you.
Happy Pride.
Woo!